Ladies and gentlemen, if you follow chess at all, then you're certainly aware that Magnus Carlsen is the world champion. If you follow any other major sport at all, then you're probably aware of the best player, the best team in whatever sport that may be. None of these champions did it by themselves, believe it or not. They obviously had teams, they obviously had coaches, trainers, sparring partners, and so on and so forth. But what if there were places where an athlete would have to play their coach? Well, that's the point of this video. Somebody suggested it either in my Discord or my YouTube comments. I lost that. I actually wanted to pull it up on the screen, but they thought it would be interesting to see a video of where Magnus Carlsen goes up against this coach. Now, I'm not talking about a coach that trained him since he was 2 years old up until he's now in his 30s, but I am talking about the current coach for many years now. And that coach is Peter Heine Nielsen. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I hope I'm doing it justice. He's a Danish grandmaster. Very active on the pro-transparency front as it pertains to FIDE, the international governing body of the game of chess. And he has been on Team Carlsen since 2013, if I'm not mistaken. And they played a game against each other in Brazil at the Festival da Uva. I hope I'm saying that correctly. In 2014, the same year that Brazil hosted the World Cup. And actually, Magnus was paid for chess activities in Brazil with some World Cup final tickets. Fun fact for you to use at Bard Trivia Night. They played in this tournament. This was like toward the end of the event, and Magnus had the white pieces. You'll notice that Magnus also has his highest rating ever on the official list at 2881. So Magnus was literally never stronger in his life. All right. We have e4, and Nielsen goes for c5, the Sicilian defense. Knight f3, d6, inviting what probably would have been a Najdorf Sicilian. I do not know the repertoire of Peter Nielsen. Maybe he was going to play, I don't know, a Dragendorf. But no, he was probably going to go for Najdorf. Magnus sidesteps all of that and plays bishop to b5. Bishop to b5 against the knight c6 variation is known as the Rossolimo. Against d6, it's got a few names. I always called it the Moscow variation. Chess.com calls it the Canal. I don't know why it's called Canal. Black has a few options of blocking this check. Both of these knight moves are okay. The bishop move is okay. I mean, the queen move is not like the worst thing in the world, you know, if you're an optimist. But black plays bishop d7 here. We have a trade. And white here can do a couple of different things. White can set up like this with castles rook e1 and building blocks with c3 and d4. But Magnus chooses c4. So you're going to still play d4 a little bit later in the opening. You're not going to do it this very second, and you're also not going to be recapturing with a pawn. You're instead going to control the d5 square and going for like a Marazzi-style bind, which is very common against the Sicilian defense. You'll notice that Nielsen plays g6 in order to fianchetto the bishop out to this diagonal. Magnus plays d4 now, gets this, bishop g7. And here, generally, the setup for white is f3 and something like this, with a bishop on e3, let's just say a pawn on b3, and this little cascading waterfall of pawns before castling, kind of defending everybody with the queen. Queen has a lot of responsibility in this position. I thought my dog was eating something and he wasn't supposed to be eating. But instead of that, Magnus plays the second approach to this position, which is the move h3. Now, he will still probably play the move b3, but he will most likely not play the move f3. The thing is that h3 covers knight g4, so the bishop will probably go here in the future. If it doesn't, then we're going to have a totally different texture. The thing is that now if you play f3, then this is called a Swiss cheese like of a position, right? I mean, you just dark squares are just up for grabs. You need one pawn to cover some dark squares. So Magnus plays h3, Nielsen plays castles, and Magnus castles as well. Listen, they're principled guys. Magnus is the highest rated player of all time at this point. He probably got a castle. He knows this. You know, he knows old Gotham will probably find this game and farm it for some YouTube content. So it's got to be a good influence for the kids. So rook c8 attacks the pawn. We've already talked about this. And you'll notice that this knight is a little bit loose. If you give white a couple more moves, white is going to play like this. And like I already said, everything will be defended in the white position. White just has a nice little position here, you know? Maybe he's not going to play in that order. Maybe he'll play in a slightly different order. Maybe he'll put the bishop here. Maybe he'll play a little bit more aggressively. But all in all, this is what white wants, right? So white plays b3 to defend this. And black has a few ways of creating counterplay here. For example, even the move b5 against the Marazzi is possible, although it can be taken 3 different ways. Now, it cannot be really taken like this. That's just a free horse. It cannot really be taken like this because you lose this pawn and you activate this. right? And it can't really be taken like this because of the same exact situation. Now, you theoretically could make any of those captures if you really want, but again, being the highest rated player ever, you're probably not going to do any of that. Black can also play knight c6 right away, but Nielsen plays a very interesting move. He plays a move that looks actually completely impossible at first glance. Like the move b5 that I just showed you looks impossible, but this next move by Black looks extremely impossible. He plays the move d5. I mean, that just looks like an elementary mistake. That just looks like Black miscounted. Because White has 3 pieces covering that. And unlike b5, which would have deflected one of the knights and allowed this, that doesn't exist. I mean, you go knight e4, you just lose the knight completely. So what on earth is the move d5, right? It's a move. It's actually another one of the common pawn breaks that Black has in these sort of structures. If you play this variation of the Sicilian, you're aware b5 and d5 are like the 2 major breaks, and when the rook does not go to c8 and stays here, there are some positions where Black can play f5 as well. So it's a very fluid and dynamic position. White really has to be careful. Black's position is like a porcupine, you know, it's like very spiky. So d5. Again, you cannot do this because you hang the knight, but what if you use the knight and you capture on d5? That's one of the options. It will happen potentially in a moment. But Magnus plays here, because now Black obviously has no recaptures, right? I mean, Black is not going to be taking this, but then what is Black going to be doing? Well, Black is going to be taking that, after all. The point is that if you take with the pawn, again, you're losing the knight. But I don't understand. What if you take with the knight? What? Black, everything's defended. It's not. The knights are actually skewered to each other. So if this knight moves, White loses this horse, right? It's just... So... That's exactly what Nielsen does. He plays the move e6. So what is Magnus going to do? I mean, if Magnus just retreats, Black takes the knight in the center, there's absolutely nothing here. You can actually, if you'd like to, you can pause here and try to find the move for White, because it's actually an absurd move. It doesn't just retreat. It doesn't just accept defeat. My dog he's staring in the mirror. He gets very perplexed. He freaks himself out every day because he's right there. Yeah, the move here for White is nothing short of spectacular. It's the move bishop to h6. That is an amazing move. So the point of this move is that this bishop is the main guard of this king. Okay, everything else, right? I just mentioned this. Every pawn is on a light square, so if you remove the bishop, the dark squares are very weak. It cannot be taken because the same knight that you're trying to take now goes here. And that's just the fork of a king and a queen. These guys are too strong. That's obviously not going to happen. Bishop h6 is an amazing move because now you know that Black is going to play this move. And prior to taking back on d5, you are going to take on g7 and leave the king with some things to think about. All right, he's got no more protection, right? f6, h6, all kind of weak. You don't have to do that with White. You can also play queen d2, adding a layer of defense. If Black were to take on c4, then you can capture and set up various threats on the king with moves like queen c3. I mean, just to show you how powerful this is double check, which is the most powerful tactic in chess. The king is now covered on all of these squares, and no matter where he moves, there's mate. So king g8, queen g7, king f8, queen h8. Would Peter Nielsen have lost the game in 19 moves via checkmate? No. But that threat would have existed, okay? Instead of that, Magnus takes on g7, king g7, and does this. And this is like a worse nightmare to be playing against a guy like Magnus. I mean, Magnus, his entire, I think, difference maker between him and other 2,700 grandmasters is endurance and ability to pose problems in otherwise equal positions. He does not care what the engine thinks of his games. He doesn't care. He just plays chess. He plays things practically difficult to play for humans. He is the best, I think, practical, universal player of positions on the planet. If you just take a quick look at this position, you say they both have queens, 2 rooks, a knight, and literally the same pawns. A, B, F, G, H. So why would White possibly be better here, right? So Magnus, to even justify that, offers a queen exchange. Now, this just looks like 2 dudes who want to make a draw and grab a beer. Like, you would think the game is just going to end, like this. Rook d8, king g2, rook d1, rook d1, rook d8. Like, it's just 2 guys who are going to trade all the pieces and grab a beer. But that's not what's happening. Because after the queen trade, black still needs one move to consolidate. That's what black needs. Black needs to play one move and then bring his rook. How do you prevent that? How do you prevent black from playing knight c6? You can offer him 20 bucks, 50 bucks, depending on his price, 100 bucks, you know. But how else? How do you prevent the move knight c6 here? The knight can't attack the rook, but one of white's rooks can kind of attack the rook, forcing it to make a decision. And if you trade, the second that you move the knight, you give away that square, and that is where I'm headed. And the thing is, you have to move the knight here. You have no choice, because what will white play here to paralyze black forever? White will play rook d8. The game is just over if white plays rook d8. Black can no longer move either of these pieces, right? So you cannot allow that. So you have to play knight c6, and now Magnus plays rook d7. But, okay, so what? Rook d7 attacks the pawn on b7. What's the big deal? He will just play the move b6. Sure. But then I will create a threat on this pawn. You cannot play rook f8 because I have this check. It's a fork. You can't take because you're pinned. So Magnus somehow he's just a headache. He's just a nuisance of a player to play against. The threats are never ending. Okay, black plays knight to e5. Fantastic, I slide my rook over to c7, maybe even rook b7. Now, you would think for a brief moment here, the pressure is gone, right? Because black now kicks out the knight. That's it, there's no threats. There's no threats, but there's also no moves. Right, like black cannot move the rook because this pawn will be under fire by this rook. If black plays the move a5, for instance, then white will begin a new initiative with f4. And where is this knight going? The knight has to wander into white's territory. White will immediately go for this pawn. After this pawn becomes an asset, f5, rook b7. So every move that black makes, he has to think about what he's weakening in his position, right? And the worst part is he's playing Magnus. It's not like he's playing me. If he was playing me, he'd be like, oh, the initiative's gone, right? So g5, okay, but now we've weakened some of these squares. g3 with the potential idea to play f4, king g6, also potential idea, we gotta bring the king. I mean, the king becomes an important asset in these endgames. Black plays f5, Magnus rotates back to d2, and in incredible fashion here, Magnus offers a trade of knights. Like, again, it seems like a game where two guys are trading all the pieces to get a completely equal endgame, to make the draw, go grab beers. Magnus is trading all of the pieces to leave his opponent in a situation where his rook dominates the other one, and he's going to try to play that endgame for a win. Black doesn't really have a choice. Like, if black goes back to f7 here, he gets forced backwards, and now his pawns are going to get hunted. He can defend them, but then knight e6 comes, and you slowly start losing everything. So Nielsen now has rook and 5 versus rook and 5, right? It's got rook and 5, but weakness here, potential weakness there. Magnus goes for that pawn's dead. Or is it? You can play king f6 here maybe, and then try to trap the rook. That looks like an option. But if you play king to f6, which gets played in the game, Magnus has an option to deflect, but still same problem. So is this pawn actually lost? Well, Magnus plays b4. The idea of b4 is I want to freeze your pawns forever. So I want to play b5. That's called fixing your pawns. I want to not let your pawns move anymore. One pawn will dominate two. This will be a permanent target for me in the position. Black takes this moment to give away the h-pawn. He doesn't play king g6, which looks like a really nice move, because rook c7, b5 will come, and he doesn't want to get this frozen. So he plays h4, aggressive counterplay, sacrificing one of the pawns. He could have thrown in king g6. I'm not exactly sure what he didn't like about this move. Maybe time is getting low, which is a possibility. He decided to play this and give away this pawn entirely to now activate his rook. You'll notice that white has been kicked off the what was I trying to say? Just malfunction. I was trying to say the eye line. That's not a thing. I meant to say line of sight. Hey, goof. He hears dogs. Now he's standing up on the windowsill. Goodness. Puppy ownership is it's just nobody can possibly prepare you for this, honestly. It's just like the amount of things that dogs do that are not on guides anywhere, like follow you to the shower every day and try to lick your legs after. Yeah. H4 anyway, and we have the following position, okay? Rook G8 check, King F3, Rook C8, and Black is trying to activate the rook down this way to try to go for his own weaknesses. You'll notice Magnus now has a 4-on-3. We've gone from 5-5 to 4-3. Black still has equal chances here in the endgame, but he is down a pawn. And he could potentially be down more pawns than that if he's not careful. So A4. All right, Black plays Rook C3 check. King G2, Rook A3. This attacks the pawn on A4, right? And also just trying to keep the rook active. Cutting off the king, that's what that's called. All right, we have B5. This was the entire idea of Magnus, to freeze these pawns completely, but he can't go and win that pawn because this rook is very active. Black did a nice thing there. He sacrificed the pawn for activity of his rook, which is equally important in the endgame. The move King G5 is now played by Peter Nielsen. The rook goes to C4, and Black plays the move F4, taking away more space, shutting this down, and maybe activating his king a little bit more, either that way or this way, depending on what White does now. Rook D4. And Magnus just keeps playing. The thing about chess is that even though Black made it this far, he still has to make moves every single time his clock runs. Okay? You can't just hit a pause button and go, it's 0.3. Okay? Stockfish says it's a draw. You have to play moves. King F5, Magnus gives a check, the king comes forward, and now we have Rook to G5. Rook G5 has a couple of ideas. First of all, Rook takes A4 is just a free pawn. But the idea is that now you've cut the Black king off, and here comes H4. This king sidestepped this way, so now there's nobody to monitor the H-pawn. So the H-pawn suddenly becomes a massive asset, right? In the white position. I have to make sure the dog doesn't pull the blinds down. This is a battle now. Nielsen plays the move F3 check. He doesn't have to play the move F3 check. He could play, for example, Rook A1 first, then F3 check with this idea and try to deflect this king. If king to H2, then there might be Rook F1. But again, it's a very murky position. There's all sorts of weird coordinations and tactics here where White can actually defend the pawn and potentially win the one on F3. So we have H4, F3 check, King G3, and now we check this king. This king now has to relinquish the defense of the F3 pawn. And Magnus doesn't take it yet. Doesn't even take it now. What is he doing? Why isn't he taking on F3? I think it has to do with this pawn. You see, a while ago when Magnus gave away the A4 pawn to begin pushing the H pawn and try to create some winning chances, try to squeeze the last drop of juice out of this fruit, all right? He was like, wait a minute, B pawn is also weak. I think I've got to guard that pawn before I take the one on F3, and now he does that. Okay, so a couple of things are at play here. It's F and H versus nothing, right? There's nothing there. It's F and H. So if all three of these pawns fall off the board, F and H versus a king and a rook could be a draw. You have to defend it correctly, but it could be a draw, okay? So A6 takes. Now, in hindsight, when analyzing this game before I presented it to you, it seemed to be the big mistake of Nielsen to play the move A6. This pawn blockade is very strong and it doesn't let Black move, but apparently if Nielsen had just kind of moved his rook around and created either threats of check or just like horizontal pressure on the pawn, it seems like this trade was incorrect. Like if White goes and just like tries to win that pawn on A7, he will lose H4. And if he loses H4 and B5, it's Rook and 1 versus Rook and 1, which Magnus is great, but he ain't winning it. He's not winning that. So, but trading the pawn and kind of making his rook weaker like this is probably not the way to go. Now, Nielsen probably thought in all the long runs, F and H is a draw. That's what I imagine, or he was low on time, right? It seems upon further analysis, instead of playing A6, he can play Rook C1. That is definitely not the end of the story. Magnus will still try to create problems with moves like King F4, potentially giving away the H4 pawn, and then trying to bring his F pawn forward, and trying to win this endgame. And who knows, maybe White just has actual practical winning chances in this endgame, because his pawns are, Black's pawns are just frozen. You know, Black's pawns are frozen. You can try to go back this way, but maybe Rook D4, Rook D7. I don't know. And it could be that after King F4, you don't take the pawn. Maybe you play rook c5 and you just don't let black's king cross that line. There's defenses here, potentially. But Nielsen decides, I'm going to trade pawns. And Magnus is like, all right, I have now transformed the position. That is one of Magnus's greatest strengths as a player. Transforming microscopic advantages into practical winning chances. He plays king g3, and finally Nielsen parts ways with the b-pawn. Magnus, though, very professional, gives a check, forces the king back, and then takes. You see, if Magnus had just taken on b6 like this, then rook g1, and he would have probably lost one of his pawns. But by checking his opponent into a check, we have the following position. Now, I think if you left Stockfish here, probably black draws this game, but that doesn't mean that white can't create problems. This is not... The F and H should be a draw. The way you're supposed to draw it, depending on where these pawns are, is black should play actively on f7. Do not get your king cut off on the back rank. Active play on f7. Rook stands in the corner, ready to either give side checks or back checks. And do not get into a situation of opposition. So we have rook b5 check, king h6. I believe king g6, like I said, king g6, king g4, you know, you can give this check, king f4, you can go back to the corner. But in general, standing on f7 is oftentimes the easiest defensive task. And anytime the king goes forward, front check or side check. King h6, but again, probably time is low. So rook g1, king f5, and yeah, we see that the king is kind of not being allowed to get to f7 now, potentially. So rook a1, Magnus plays f4, and Stockfish here gives an incredible line where black can make a dart for the h-pawn and try to hold the draw, and like, literally, black can completely break all principles, walk to the h-pawn, surrender this pawn moving forward, but apparently just come right back, and this is a draw. This is something in rook endgames known as short side defense. You can watch an entire video series on this stuff, on what short side defense is. It's where, obviously, the short side of defense, if you were here, you would not be holding this, and you either give side checks or, like I said, long checks. Your king hangs around, and you know, you try to make a draw from this position. But Nielsen decides to just kind of play the F and H defense, rook e5. And I think here, the winning move for Magnus was rook e6, setting up a discovered attack on this king and trying to join back the pawns. The point is that now if you give a side check, I shield myself, and if you try to come back here, you're too late. Remember why the black king had to be on f7? Do you remember that? I just said the king has to be on f7? Because that has to prevent this king from walking in front of its own pawn. So rook e6, I think, was winning, but he plays f5, which might also be practically winning against the human. He gives away this pawn, and now we have a situation, finally, black has to find one final kind of defensive move. Benji, what are you doing? Apologies. Black has to find one final defensive move or task, and it's to keep his rook on the h-file. He has to just accept that his king is bad and leave his rook cut off so that it doesn't get mated. But Nielsen on move 60 is like, my king has no moves, king h5. And king h5 surrenders the opportunity of being checked over here and for the king to walk and allow the pawn forward. And yeah, now that the king is behind the pawn, king g6, we clear the path for the pawn. And like this king had to be on that side. So Nielsen here had to play one final defensive measure, which was just making sure that the king could stick around with that one. King g5 wouldn't be the way because rook f1 and f6. You would have to play king h7 and so on. But yeah, Magnus made the path for his pawn. The pawn now goes. The rook is ready to stand behind the pawn as well and check the king. And that's it. And it took 68 moves. But Peter Nielsen resigns, seeing as though Magnus Carlsen probably was taught how to checkmate with king and rook. But you should never resign in this position, okay? Make your opponent checkmate you, because you're probably not playing the world champion. As all of you like to say, Magnus has never beaten you guys, right? You are undefeated against Magnus. So this was the one modern game that I've seen Magnus play against his trainer. He does have a team, though. He does have Gustafsson. He does have Fressene. I would be interested to hear your thoughts if you'd like to see any of those games. But seeing as though the candidates are currently ongoing, I think it would be fun to throw a game here on the rest day of Magnus playing against his trainer. Yeah, I mean, it took down to the last pawn. You don't get a more Magnesian game than this. 1 pawn and a rook endgame to beat your trainer. That was, of course, Peter Nielsen's only loss of that tournament. He completely slaughtered everybody else. Yeah. And if you're lucky enough to be catching this in the middle of the candidates tournament, I will see you all. I will see you all tomorrow for round number 7. But if you're just watching this because the YouTube algorithm suggested it, hi, and also bye. Go watch my other videos. Get out of here.